Bon dia, benvinguts en aquesta lliçó d'economia. En primer lloc volia excusar el rector que tenia compromisos avui mateix fora de Barcelona i no eren ineludibles. On behalf of the rector, I want to apologize for his absence here in this important event. I also want to thank Professor Lewinstein for accepting our invitation to give the annual opening lecture. This is our 20th anniversary, an important landmark in our short but intensive life as a university. Passo la paraula al degà de la Facultat de Ciències Econòmiques i Empresarials, Albert Carreras.
Moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies també al rector. És un plaer per a nosaltres estar com cada any amb la lliçó d'economia que marca l'apertura formal del curs. Vam començar, tots ho sabeu, ja fa gairebé 3 setmanes, però l'apertura formal del curs, la inauguració, la fem amb la lliçó d'economia. Aquesta és la 20a lliçó d'economia, és el 20è curs que comença pels estudiants d'ara una bona colla de titulacions diferents. És un nou curs pels estudiants de la llicenciatura d'Economia i d'Administració i Direcció d'Empreses, però també és el primer curs pels estudiants dels graus d'Economia i Administració i Direcció d'Empreses, pel grau de Ciències Empresarials i pel grau d'International Business Economics. Per a tots aquests és una aventura nova la que avui comença. En convidar el professor Lewinstein a donar la lliçó d'Economia, tractem que, com cada any, hi hagi un aspecte nou d'allò que s'ensenya aquí a la facultat que estigui posat de relleu. Hem demanat en aquesta ocasió a un investigador i professor nostre, el professor Robin Hogarth, que fos el presentador del conferenciant convidat d'aquest any, que és, com repeteixo, el professor Lewinstein de Carnegie Mellon i que per aquells de vosaltres que ja teniu una mica de formació segurament sabreu apreciar que és Herbert Simon Professor of Psychology and Economics. Robin?
It gives me a really great pleasure to introduce to the audience today George Lowenstein, who is, as Albert just said, the Herbert A. Simon Professor of Psychology and Economics at Carnegie Mellon University. Anybody who knows about Carnegie Mellon University and Herbert Simon can realize what a great tribute that is to George Lowenstein. George did his PhD at Yale. He then went to the University of Chicago, where I was fortunate enough to be with him on the faculty, and in 1990 joined Carnegie Mellon. George represents a field which is now called behavioral economics, which is a field that recognizes that economics doesn't have necessarily the answers to the world's problems, and perhaps it could take a little help from other disciplines, and in this case, mainly from psychology. And so the discipline he works in is looking very often at how psychological insights can actually help better appreciation of economic phenomena. 3 things I'd like to mention about George. First of all, he's always at the cutting edge of things. If you want to know what's the next big topic that's going to happen, go and talk to George. He was the person who got involved in bringing the interest of economists of emotions into decision making. He was one of the first people to get involved in what's now called neuroeconomics. And going back to his dissertation work, he was interested in a problem which I think is fascinating, which is intertemporal choice, and he has attacked those issues. So basically, George is always at the forefront. Secondly, he always gets involved in very interesting topics. If you look through his vita, you find things like articles about curiosity. I've often wanted to ask George how he got curious about curiosity, but anyway, there's a whole study on curiosity, which I find fascinating. And third, the interesting thing about George is he's not tied to any one particular methodological approach. His work, there's some theoretical work involving pretty heavy mathematics, there's some work that was experimental, there's some survey work, so he's a master of different methodologies, and that makes his work always very interesting. And so, so having given that build-up, I'd like to now then pass you over to George. George?
Clip, which should appear on the screen at this moment.
greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't know how many of you recognize that, but it's the famous "Greed is Good" speech from the movie Wall Street. And Michael Douglas won an Academy Award for Best Actor for that role. And this is the most famous part of the movie. And I think it's so famous because he delivers it in such a compelling fashion. He delivers the message in such a compelling fashion, and yet it's such a weird message. Because for most people, the idea that greed is good, of course, is a strange idea that greed is good. Now, for economic students, I think that idea is less strange, because one of the first things that we learn in introductory economics is about Adam Smith's invisible hand, which is the idea that individuals pursuing their own self-interest, which could be viewed as greed, promotes the public good. What I'm going to do in this talk is to question that assumption, to question the idea that greed is necessarily good. If maybe the most definitive work of research on greed is an old study, goes back to 1953, by Donald Cressy. He was a sociologist. He wrote a book titled Other People's Money, and it's about embezzlers. And he interviewed hundreds of incarcerated embezzlers who were in jail. He pored through large data sets collected by other researchers who interviewed embezzlers, and he subjected his database to something that he called negative case analysis, which is something that more of us should do. What he did is he started looking at these interviews, and he generated a hypothesis, and then he would read more interviews and see whether the new interviews that he read contradicted his hypothesis. And if they did, then he would update his hypothesis, his theory. And he kept updating his theory. He kept on subjecting his theory to critical analysis by reading new interviews, until he found a theory that he believed fit virtually all of the interviews that he read, all of these interviews with embezzlers. And his conclusion was that virtually all embezzlers have two qualities. Well, first, he found that embezzlement is very rarely due to garden variety interest in getting more money. Very few people embezzle money just because embezzlement, by the way, is basically stealing money from one's own organization. Very few people embezzle more money just because they think, oh, it would be nice to have a little bit more money. What he found was that people who embezzled money almost always had some special need for additional funds. They were kind of desperate for the additional money. And he also found that the second critical element of embezzlement was that people had to be able to rationalize their behavior, to tell some kind of story to make it okay. So on page 742, which gives you a clue of how long the book was, he finally concludes with the following statement: trusted persons become trust violators when they conceive of themselves as having a financial problem which is non-shareable. So, for example, almost all of the embezzlers were men. Some of them had gambling problems. Some of them had drug addiction problems. Some of them had mistresses. They couldn't talk. They couldn't tell their wives about it. They couldn't tell their families about it. So they had non-shareable financial problem. They have knowledge or awareness that this problem can be secretly resolved by violation of their position of financial trust, and are able to apply to their own conduct in that situation verbalizations which enable them to adjust their conception of themselves as trusted persons with their conceptions of themselves as users of the entrusted funds or property. In other words, they were able to rationalize their behavior. And this is really, these two components are the two things that I'm going to talk about today. The special need for additional funds is going to be the first part of my talk, where I'm going to discuss research on greed and cheating, how greed leads to cheating. And the second part of the talk is a little piece, one piece of the puzzle about how people rationalize unethical behavior. And this is research that my colleagues and I have done on using middlemen, that is, hired people, to do one's dirty work for one. So part one about greed and cheating. This is research with Leslie John, current graduate student, and Scott Rick, who's a ex-graduate student. So in conventional economists, to the extent that they talk about greed at all, view greed as synonymous with self-interest. Greed is just another word for self-interest. Self-interest is generally assumed to be good, consistent with the invisible hand, and hence you reach the conclusion that greed is good. Now, ordinary people use the term greed in a very different way from the way that economists use the term. And very often, I've found in my own research that when economists use a term in a non-customary way, when economists use a term differently from the way that the person on the street uses the term, that often signals something that's wrong with economic theory. And this is no exception. Dictionary.com, that esteemed source, defines greed as an excessive or rapacious desire, especially for wealth or possessions. And so I think that greed, my own view of greed, is that greed is motivation for some goal which is taken beyond the point of self-interest, to the point where it becomes often self-destructive and in other cases destructive to other people or to values that an individual holds dearly. The implication of this is that, quite contrary to the idea that greed is synonymous with self-interest, in fact, greed is the antithesis of self-interest. Greed is a motivation that's so strong that it diverts us from self-interest. Why would somebody become motivated to achieve some goal beyond the point of self-interest? Why would somebody become obsessed with achieving a goal? Well, a clue to that, the answer to that question, comes from a theory that some of you may have heard of. It's called prospect theory, and it's from a theory proposed by Kahneman and Tversky. And in prospect theory, they propose that instead of the traditional utility function, people have what they call a value function, which is defined over gains and losses. And the most essential feature of prospect theory is what is called loss aversion. People hate losing money. They hate losing money much more than they like gaining money. You can see this very simply. If you offer somebody a 50-50 chance to gain $100 or lose $100, virtually 100% of people will turn it down. If you offer them a 50-50 chance to gain $150, maybe I should use euros, and lose 100 euros, most people will turn it down. Once you get up to a gain of 200 euros versus a loss of $100, now you're starting to get a few people who will agree to play the gamble. People hate losing money. And I think that this gives the answer to the question of why someone would become motivated beyond the point of self-interest. So as a result of loss aversion, when people are in a situation of loss aversion, that is when they're likely to pursue a goal excessively to the detriment of other valued goals. That is when they fall below some key point of reference. And there are a bunch of ways that people can feel in the loss. For example, suppose that you're in a profession which has been historically highly paid, but now your profession pay scale declines. Or suppose that you were a very successful actor or a very successful business person and your fortunes decline. Well, you're going to be in a situation of losses, and you're going to become kind of hyper-motivated to regain your past stature. Prior expectations are another important point of reference which people can fall below and become loss-averse. So, for example, if you have a very high-achieving student and all of a sudden they get into a class and they just can't figure out how to deal with the class. They know that they're going to get a low grade and they have very high expectations. Or in other cases, what other people are getting becomes a reference point. You're looking over your shoulder at what other people get. So like in the real estate boom and in the dot-com boom, if you were of my age, then you were talking to your neighbors, you would hear all these stories about people making a killing, and you knew that you weren't making a killing. And so that puts you in the domain of losses. And when people are in the domain of losses, they become very desperate to get back to this point. They're very highly motivated. There's a lot of evidence that people behave unethically when they are below a subjective reference point, when they're in the domain of losses. In taxation, if you look at people who are owed, when tax day comes, if you look at people who are owed money by the government versus people who owe money to the government, what you find is that people who owe money to the government are much more likely to cheat on their taxes than people who are expecting to get a refund from the government. Research on lies find that the vast majority of lies originate with bad behavior. People tell a small lie and then they get trapped, very much like Cressy's embezzlers got trapped by their own bad behavior. Cheating, research on cheating finds that students who have ambitious goals, especially if those goals come from their parents, are more likely to cheat. And finally, a lot of the corporate scandals that keep recurring can be traced to increased competition, so that companies are not, and professionals are not doing as well as they expected to do, as they believe that they should do. So the studies that I'm going to show you first examine the impact of competition, that is people having high reference points, being in the domain of losses, on cheating when they're performing a task to earn money. So there's been a lot of prior research on cheating, a lot of it very recent. It's a very active area of research right now. Most of this research suggests that cheating is not well explained by a standard economic model. So there is research by Mazur and co-authors showing that when people have an opportunity to cheat, they don't go all out cheating. People tend to cheat just a little bit. Why do they do that? Because they want to maintain their self-image. They cheat just enough so they can kind of persuade themselves that they're not really cheating. There's research showing that if you deplete people's willpower, they cheat more. So if you get people tired out, like if you have them squeeze a hand press for a long time, and so they're using willpower to force themselves to keep this hand squeezer depressed, they're more likely to cheat. There's research on social norms showing that social norms have a big impact on cheating. These researchers, they put the subject in the presence of another person who was cheating. For half of these people, the other person who was cheating was from the same university, and for the other half, the other person who was cheating was from a rival university. And when the person who was cheating was from the same university, then the subject themselves were more likely to cheat. But when the person who they observed cheating was from a different university, a rival university, then they were actually less likely to cheat. They didn't want to, because they didn't like this person from the other university, they didn't want to be like them. And when they saw them cheat, they decided, well, I'm not going to cheat. I'm not like that person from that university. There's research showing that when there's a perception of abundance, if people think basically that the experimenter has deep pockets, they're more likely to cheat. And also there's research showing that if you teach people that individuals don't have free will, that we're basically automatons, that we don't make our own decisions, then people are more likely to cheat. Because by doing that, when you tell people that there is no free will as an illusion, then people don't feel responsible for their behavior. The research I'm going to show you about looks at the impact of competition on cheating. So here's I'm going to show you 3 studies from a very large number of studies that we've done. This is the first study we conducted. In this study, the subjects, The subjects are recruited in groups of 8. They do a multi-round trivia task. In each round, they're given 4 minutes to answer 10 questions in workbooks. And the workbooks, at the end of the session, they throw the workbooks away. We, of course, collect them, and so we can tell, in various ways, we can tell whether they cheated. And the questions are what are called shelling coordination questions. So an example might be, name a type of bird that has long legs. Now, what we want from you is we want you to name the type of bird that most people think of when they answer this question. So your goal isn't to name the bird that has the longest legs. Your object is to name the type of bird that most people think of as a bird with long legs. And we chose this type of question because it's easy to persuade. Suppose that you think to yourself, ostrich. That's the true answer. That's the correct answer to this question. That's the answer that most people give. But suppose you think to yourself, ostrich, but then you think, oh, flamingo, and you answer flamingo. Well, it's easy to persuade, and then you discover, oh, the true answer is ostrich. Well, it's easy to persuade yourself, well, I thought of ostrich. I didn't say it. I mean, I didn't actually answer that, but I thought of it, so I'm going to give myself credit for that question. And so we chose these questions because we thought they would be questions that people would find it easy to cheat on. So what we do is we distribute, after people take the quiz, we distribute an answer key. Subjects grade their own work. They enter their score into a computer, and they're given feedback on how much money they earned for that round. And the way it worked was, in the first round, subjects didn't know how they'd be paid, but after they turned in their first score, then we explained to them how they'd be paid. In one condition, the egoistic condition, they got 25 cents for every answer that they got right. And they got performance only on how well they themselves were doing. In the public condition, they also got paid 25 cents for every correct answer, but in that case, we publicized how well they did and how well everyone else did. And we thought that would increase, publicizing the scores would increase the level of competition. And finally, in the above median condition, we not only publicized the scores, but we only paid people if they were above the median score. So we only paid the top scoring people. And we thought that would ratchet up the level of competition even more. So our prediction was that we'd get more cheating in the egoistic condition than the public condition than the egoistic private condition, and more in the above median condition than in the public condition. This shows what a subject in the egoistic private condition would see. They would see only their own name, the number correct, and the amount that they earned. This is the egoistic public. Now you can see that they see how much everyone got right and how much everybody earned. And this is the above median public. And you see that only the people who got the highest scores are paid. Everyone else gets 0. Here are the results. This is just looking at the raw scores. We know from other studies that we've done, the only way to get an extra high score here is to cheat. You can't if you try harder, it doesn't help. So when you see differences in lines here, you're seeing evidence of cheating. And what you see is that cheating is, as we predicted, cheating is greater when we publicize scores than when they're private, and cheating is the greatest when only people in the above median condition. And this is a highly significant effect. We also, as I said, we collected the answer sheets so we could actually look at real cheating as well. And so when we looked to see how often we scored them, and then we compared their score to the score that they told us, and you see exactly the same pattern. This is this mean score overstatement, which is smallest in the private condition, greater in the public condition, and greatest in the above median condition. We also asked them some other questions at the end. We asked them questions to see kind of how wound up they were during the game. So we had them rate their agreement with 9 items. For example, this game was stressful, this game was competitive, my top priority was to beat the other participants, and you see exactly the same pattern here. And we also asked them, we wanted to see if they thought that other people were cheating. And so we asked questions like, I think that other participants graded their answers accurately, graded their answers questionably, carefully, graded their answers in a loose manner, in other words, cheated, but we didn't use the term cheating, and so on. And once again, you see the same pattern. What this shows is that when people are in a situation of great competitiveness, not only do they cheat more, but they also believe that other people are more likely to cheat. And that's, it's easier, when you think that other people are cheating, of course, it's easier to cheat yourself. So conclusions from this study: competition increases cheating, simply displaying the results increased competition and therefore cheating, and conditions that made people cheat also made them believe that other people were cheating, which can make people feel less bad about cheating themselves. In the next study I want to show you, we wanted to show that, show that this reference point effect, the idea that being below a reference point increases cheating, that it's not just a matter of pure economic incentives. So we did the same task again, and this is a 2x2 factorial experiment. Some of the subjects were paid 5 cents, and some of the subjects were paid 25 cents for each question that they got right. And some of the subjects crossed with that manipulation. Some of the subjects were unaware of the other payment, and some subjects were aware. So in the aware condition, we would bring the subject in, and we'd say, you're going to either get 5 cents or 25 cents for each question that you get right. Flip a coin, and the coin flip is going to determine whether you get 5 cents or 25 cents. So what we predicted was that when subjects didn't know about the other condition, that people would cheat more in the 25-cent condition than in the 5-cent condition, because the incentives for cheating were greater. They got paid more. They made more money by cheating in the 25-cent condition than in the 5-cent condition. But we thought that in the condition where they flipped the coin and they knew that they could have gotten, let's say they're in the 5-cent condition, they knew that they could have gotten 25 cents. Now they're going to be angry. They're going to be angry that they're being paid so little that they could have been making 25 cents. And so we expected that because now they are below their reference point, they're in the domain of losses. So we expected that when they flipped the coin, that subjects who got 5 cents per problem would cheat more than subjects who got 25 cents. Of course, that is what we found. When they weren't aware of what other people were making, they cheated more for 25 cents than for 5 cents. But when they were aware that they could have gotten the other amount of money, they cheated more for 5 cents than for 25 cents. Now, I've had a lot, from being a professor, I've had a lot of exposure to cases of cheating, and I've often noticed a phenomenon, which is that it seems to me that once people start to cheat and they get away with it, they keep cheating. Now, there's two possible explanations for that. One possible explanation is that some of us are cheaters and some of us are not cheaters, and if you discover somebody cheating, and that means that they're a cheater, and if you look at other behavior, you'll find that they're probably a cheater in other areas too, which is what you generally find. If you catch somebody cheating and you go back and look at their record, very often you can uncover earlier cheating. But the other possibility is that cheating is kind of habit forming. Once you cheat and you get away with it, then it's very tempting to cheat again. It's almost like an addiction. And this study looks to see whether that is the case. So in this study, it's the same quiz again. The subjects do 4 rounds of 10 questions each. They're paid 25 cents for each correct answer. And in the first 2 rounds, half of the subjects are not given the opportunity to cheat. We grade their quizzes, so they can't cheat. The other half are given the opportunity to cheat. They self-grade. And then in the second 2 rounds, all subjects are given an opportunity to cheat. And so our prediction here was, if cheating is habit-forming, then subjects who had the opportunity to cheat in the first half, and who very likely did cheat, would be more likely to cheat in the second half than subjects who didn't have the opportunity to cheat in the first half. And here's a graph showing the results. There's a little bit of learning here but also just by fluke, the questions seem to have gotten easier. But what you see is that when they grade themselves, in the first 2 rounds, they do better than when we grade them. But in the second 2 rounds, where the 2 conditions are identical, they all grade themselves, now the people who graded themselves in the first round cheat at a higher rate than the people who we graded. So a general summary of the results is that different types of competition lead to loss aversion. That is that when people are in a competitive situation, they often fall below their reference point. They feel like they're in the domain of loss, and that produces greed. Really, the point here is that we think of greed as kind of an evil, bad thing, but really, greed is, I would say greed is much more a type of desperation. People who are greedy are desperate. And so actually, in some ways, people who are greedy are to be pitied more than to be hated. So people get into a situation of greed that leads to unethical or illegal activities, and once it also leads to, but they become habituated to their unethical activities, and once they behave unethically, they believe that other people are behaving unethically, and that makes it easier for them to behave unethically. So you get a kind of feedback loop. This set of studies, I believe, addresses a question raised by Andre Schleifer. He's one of the most famous living economists, in a paper titled, "Does Competition Destroy Ethical Behavior?" And in the paper, Schleifer concludes that conduct described as unethical and blamed on greed is sometimes a consequence of market competition. And then he goes on and he says, "My point is to pinpoint the crucial role of competition as opposed to greed." He views competition and greed as 2 alternative explanations for unethical behavior. What I think this research shows is that competition and greed are not competing explanations, but in fact that competition produces greed. Competition leads to greed. Moreover, once people start cheating, as I've shown you, they become habituated to it, and once people start cheating, they assume that other people too. That is, and believing that other people too, you remember that I talked about Cressy's 2 ideas, the second idea being rationalization. The idea that other people are cheating provides a kind of rationalization, a way of justifying one's own cheating. And that brings me to the second part of my talk, which is a set of studies on the theme of self-interest through agency. Let me define a couple of terms that are critical. An agent is somebody who you hire. It's somebody who you hire to do a task. The principal is the person who hires the agent. These are economic terms. Why do we hire agents, that is, people to work for us? The standard economic account of why we hire agents is, first, we don't have enough time. So we might be perfectly capable of cleaning our own house, but if we're very busy, we might hire somebody to clean our house for us. We just don't have enough time. The second reason is we hire people who because we lack the skills or expertise that the people we hire have. Other people have expertise. That might be why we hire somebody to help us with our investments, because we believe that they know more about investing than we do. In this paper, we examine an alternative reason that people hire agents, that principals hire agents, and this is rationalization. By hiring agents allows a principal to behave selfishly or unethically without taking responsibility. For example, Nike. Nike treats its employees extremely well. They have great benefit packages, very good wages, wonderful working conditions. However, Nike hires companies to make its shoes, and those companies operate sweatshops. So Nike can say, "Oh, we're not running sweatshops. We're not hiring sweatshop labor. All we're doing is paying people for ordering shoes from companies." And so they can rationalize the fact that their shoes are produced in sweatshop conditions. Nowadays, with the economic crisis, of course, you have a lot of people being fired from their jobs, and the newest category of employment, a rising type of employment, are so-called consultants who you hire to fire people for you. They come into the company, and and it's too painful for you to tell somebody, after 20 years, sorry, you've lost your job. So you hire somebody to do that for you. Okay, so the goals of this paper are to test whether actions taken by hired agents are more selfish than actions that people take directly, and to test whether the principal, the person who hires the agent who acts unethically, feels less responsible for the actions that those agents take. This is I'm only going to show you 2 experiments. In this experiment, the first experiment, there were 3 conditions. In the baseline condition, people play a standard, what's called a dictator game. A dictator game is the simplest game imaginable. The principal is given $10, and they're given the opportunity to share however much of it or however little they want with the recipient, not the agent, with the recipient. In the agent condition, the principal doesn't directly give the money to the recipient, but the principal hires an agent, and the agent gives the principal's money to the recipient. And in the third condition, this is the agent choice condition. It's the same as the agent condition, but in the last of 12 rounds of this game, the principals are allowed to decide whether to hire an agent to make the decision for them or to make the decision themselves. So it's very important that you understand the setup. So the principal, each of these 12 rounds, the principal gets $10 and gets to decide how much to share with the recipient. And in 2 of the conditions, they hire agents who make the decision of how much of their money to give away. In these experiments, there are always 6 principals, 6 recipients, and in the agent conditions, there are 3 agents. 12 rounds, $10 endowment in each round. There's random matching between the principal and the recipient, and principals and recipients are paid for one randomly chosen round, and the agents, so one of the 12 rounds is chosen at random, and that counts. But the agents are paid 30 cents every time that one of the principals hires them, and that's cumulative across the whole experiment. And there's no communication, and the principals get to choose, in the cases where there are agents, these 2 conditions, the principals get to choose agents at the beginning of every round except for round 1. In round 1, we randomly assign agents to principals. And at the end of the 12 rounds, we administer a questionnaire that I'll tell you about. So here's the setup. In the baseline game, the principals are each connected with a recipient. In the agent conditions, the principals hire agents, and the agents decide how much of the principal's money to give to the recipient. Very simple. Here are the results. This shows the amount given away by the principals when they are just directly giving the money to the recipient. Now, let me say, they don't know who the recipients are. They won't meet the recipients, and so this might look like a small amount, but it's actually pretty generous to give this stranger $2 of your $10. What happens when they instead hire agents? So in each of the 12 rounds, they get to pick, I need to explain this better. In each of the 12 rounds, they get to pick an agent. If they don't like what the agent did, then they can fire their agent and hire a different agent. And that's really what drives the whole setup. And so the agents are kind of competing with one another to get hired by the principals. Back to the graph, and what you see is that giving in the agent condition, drops over time until the last round. In the last round, the agents give away a tremendous amount of money. Some agents give away $10. Can you see why that is? No, they are no longer, the principal no longer has the capacity to fire them. And by this point, the agents are annoyed at the principals because if they gave away too much money, the principals have fired them. And so the agents are getting back at the principals. They're angry at the principals, and they get back at them by giving them away a lot of their money. Now, interestingly, in the agent choice condition, in the last 4 rounds, the principal gets to choose whether to make the decision through an agent or make the decision themselves. And you can see that giving is even lower here. The mean amount is almost 0. The mean amount given is almost 0. And let's, and I'm going to get back to that in a moment. But first, if you look at the principal's decisions, what you find is that principals, suppose that their agent gives away a bunch of their money, they tend to fire agents who give away their money. So if an agent gives away less than $1 of their money to the recipient, they retain them 90% of the time. They hire them again. If the agent gives away half of their money, $5, they only retain the agent 39% of the time. And the amount shared by the agent in the previous round is a strong predictor of principal switching agents. That is, when they give away a lot, they get fired. What about the agent choice condition? This shows in the agent choice condition how many principal hired agents and how many principals decided to make the decision by themselves. And principals hired agents only 39% of the time when they had a choice. But the interesting thing here is that when they, even when they decided to make the decision on their own, they gave away very, very small amounts of money. That 10 cents, 19 cents, 8 cents, 13 cents, compared to the baseline condition, $2.23, and so on. What happened? What seems to have happened is that over the earlier 8 rounds, they kind of got used to the idea of being selfish. And so even when they made the decision themselves in the last 4 rounds, they had established a kind of personal norm of selfishness, and they were selfish themselves. So after the experience with the agent kind of corrupted them such that even if they made the decision themselves, they were much less generous than they would have been if they'd just been giving their own money away all along. Experiment 2 was similar to experiment 1, but in this case, the agent sends, before each round, the agent sends a non-binding message and they saying, this is how much if you hire me, this is how much of your money I'm going to give away. We weren't sure what would happen here. We thought there were 2 possible results. One is that knowing what the agent is going to do allows, if you want to hire a stingy agent, if you want to hire an agent who will be selfish on your behalf, now you know how the agent's going to behave. So you can go immediately and find a stingy agent. But on the other hand, it's much more difficult when the agent says, I'm going to give away 0 of your money. I'm going to leave you with all $10. It's much more difficult to justify to yourself that you're actually just hiring somebody else. It's almost as if you're making the decision yourself because you know what they're going to do. So we weren't sure what would happen. Unfortunately, what happened is that the difference between this condition and the early condition is that in the agent condition, they got stingy right from the start. And so they used this information to hire the stingy agent right from the selfish agent right from the start. And once again, so it's pretty close to 0 all along. At the end, you see the same effect. When we looked at the questionnaire responses, we found that principals felt more responsible for recipients' outcomes in the baseline condition than in the agent condition. That is, principals didn't feel responsible for what was happening when the agents were giving away their money, even though they were deliberately hiring agents who were not giving away their money, but they didn't feel responsible for that. Agents also didn't feel responsible for what happened. After all, they were being hired. They had no control. They were being forced to do it because if they gave away too much money, they'd get fired. The consequence is that the recipients got almost no money and nobody felt responsible for the outcome. And the recipients felt that they were treated more unfairly in the agent conditions, and interestingly, they blamed the agents somewhat more than they blamed the principals. Conclusions of this set of studies: people often hire middlemen not for the usual reasons, but to act unethically or selfishly on their behalf. They don't feel responsible for those agents. even if they specifically hire agents who said that they were going to behave selfishly. So the consequence is that nobody feels responsible. The middlemen just feel like they are following orders. You saw this in the Abu Ghraib case during the Iraq War, which is, of course, still going on, that the people at the top sort of closed their eyes to torture. In fact, they sort of implicitly endorsed torture, and they closed their eyes to it. And the people at the bottom who actually carried out the torture, they were just following orders. So nobody actually felt responsible for the torture that happened. General conclusions for kind of both halves of the talk. It's supposed to be a talk about greed and generosity. You'll see that I've mainly focused on the greed side of it, but I think you can view these results either as a glass half full or as a glass half empty. These studies do show that there are circumstances in which people will behave unethically, in which they'll cheat, in which they'll behave selfishly, but there are also circumstances in which people will not cheat and behave fairly generously. And so most people seem to be motivated to behave in an ethical fashion, but these studies show that ethical behavior can be undermined by greed, which is often induced by severe competition, and also by the accessibility of easy rationalizations, such as the rationalization, I didn't do it, the agent did it. So I think the general conclusion from this is unfettered competition, contrary to Gordon Gekko, unfettered competition is not always a good thing because it does unleash a lot of economic creativity and motivation, but it can also create conditions for greed to emerge. And competition can create a kind of race to the bottom in which people feel compelled to behave unethically. They see other people doing it, and as a result, they feel less guilty. So, for example, if one company offers bribes to government officials for buying the company's product, it's going to make a higher profit. Other companies will probably figure out what's going on, and they're going to feel forced to offer bribes themselves. And there's a race to the bottom where the bribes, more and more people offer bribes, and the bribes get larger and larger. Same thing with a sweatshop. If one company hires sweatshop labor, then other companies, if they don't do it, they're going to go out of business. So everyone ends up hiring sweatshop labor, and so on. And I think the policy conclusion of that is that it's very important to regulate markets in certain ways that restrict people from competing in undesirable ways. And by doing so, we can actually improve general welfare. So this is a cover of Fortune magazine from, and a key part of the slide is, this is from 2005. It's Gordon Gekko on the cover, and they asked the question, is greed still good? The hedge funds sure think so, and if Gordon Gekko were on Wall Street today, they'd eat him for breakfast. In other words, Gordon Gekko is nothing compared to what we have on Wall Street, they're saying. And of course, according to Fortune, I believe, their conclusion is that greed is still good. If we fast forward to 2008, 2009, I think we have had a pretty definitive answer to the question posed here on the cover, and I think we have a pretty strong answer that greed is not good, and that's the end.
Time for some questions.
Yes.
Do you see any gender effects? Do you look at it at all?
We, in some of our research, like the research on cheating, we have looked at gender, and we have not seen gender effects. Actually, in both studies, we looked at gender and did not see any gender effects. So it seems to apply equally well to men and women. Other questions? Yes.
you talk about the crisis, and banks have had an important role in the crisis, and some of the the reasons why some of the causes of the crisis. Some people say that the causes of the crisis are greed and stupidity, and greed is basically on the part of the businessman, or basically the banks, and there is a little bit of this effect that you were talking about when you think about competition in the banking sector.
Mm-hmm.
No? This guy Prince, the ex-CEO of Citigroup, his famous line, "While the music sounds, we will continue dancing."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, it's a reflection of what you were saying. No? When competition is so hard, when these people have high power incentives, and their bonus and their continuing in the job depends on the relative performance of their bank with respect to the other banks.
Right.
Then I mean, this is
That's right.
This
Once some of the banks started offering the securitized mortgages, all the other banks had to follow. And then once they started offering securitizing subprime mortgages, banks who didn't do it were going to fall behind. And in a way, you answered your own question. But let me just say that I think what this research shows is to attribute the events of the last several years to greed is simplistic. In fact, the events are due to greed to some degree, but greed is only the final outcome. It's not the underlying cause, and that the underlying cause is untrammeled competition with a lack of regulation, with certain practices not being regulated. Like, for example, all these practices of giving mortgages to people who couldn't handle them. And so, yes, the crisis was due to greed, but the greed itself was due to bad policies that created this unfettered competition, unregulated competition. Yes? Students, I want some questions.
Yeah, I was holding this to pass it to a student.
I want to hear your question. One time I gave a seminar in Germany, at a workshop in Germany, and when I was finished, the head academic asked a question, and none of the students asked a question. And then he turned around, none of the students raised their hand with a question. And he turned around to the students and he said, I'm going to ask Professor Lowenstein a question. And by the time he answers the question, every single one of you had better have your hand up. So we're not going to intimidate you, but we would like to, not like the German academic, but we would like to hear some questions. But while you're thinking of questions, let me answer this question.
Yes, while they think about that, about what they want to ask, let me make a comment which, it's obvious, but this gives them some time. You say regulation, it's a possible solution to greed. And of course, the obvious question then is, and how do we regulate the greed of regulators? Mm-hmm. And probably you don't have an answer, I don't have an answer, but regulators are also greedy.
Right. That's right. And of course, you have the famous Chicago School of Regulation, and the Chicago School says that regulations which supposedly are intended to benefit the consumer actually benefit the industry. And so, yes, that certainly is a problem. Many regulations that are superficially seem to benefit consumers actually benefit industry. But I think it would be too cynical, even for me, and you've probably gotten the sense from my talk that I am very cynical, but it would be even too cynical for me to think that governments are never capable of doing something that's a bit higher-minded, that really is in the interest of the population. So I do think that there's a risk of that, but that there's also potential. I see a lot of positive developments in the U.S., or at least attempts at positive developments, many of which end up being thwarted by Congress. But I think there are some positive moves on the regulation front happening in the U.S. Students, any questions? Yes.
I want to seems to undermine the judgments of the future. I mean, when greed comes, people don't think about the future. They think more about immediate winnings, right?
Yeah. That's a
Yeah, I want you to explain a little bit about this.
That's a really, really nice point. So we know that people tend to be impatient when they are, let's say, when they're in an appetitive state, when they're hungry, when they're thirsty, when they are craving a drug. We know that these things tend to produce very short-sighted behavior. People don't think about the long term. And greed is really almost like an appetite. It's a desperation. And when people are desperate, they don't think about the long term. And so that is indeed probably the major reason that greed causes people to behave in a self-destructive fashion, because they are trying to satisfy their greed in the short run and not paying attention to the long-term consequences of doing so. So yeah, that's a very profound question. Yes, while we're waiting for the, in the front, and then take the student's question. Yes?
I was saying that perhaps the most disturbing conclusion of your talk was the connection between competition and greed. Mm-hmm. And if we were to derive a sort of a normative conclusion out of that, we would say that maybe that would call for a restriction of competition. But then, shouldn't we see greed or the subsequent cheating as a sort of a cost of competition, and therefore try to evaluate competition in terms of a cost-benefit analysis? Of course, competition has this type of problems. It has a cost, but it also has enormous benefits, and probably the balance would be in favor of a net benefit. Mm-hmm. I don't know, what would you think about that?
Well, I think that you're right that an implication of this talk is that we need to restrict competition. But the key is not to just restrict competition across the board, but to restrict the manifestations of competition that we don't like. So, for example, if you have been on an airplane in the United States, you will have noticed that the seats get packed closer and closer together. There seems to be no limit to how many people they can pack in an airplane until, if you are of average height, even on a cross-the-country flight, you get sore knees. You can't really fit in your seat. And so definitely airplane companies are going to compete with one another, and that's a good thing. But maybe we should have a regulation that restricts, that mandates a certain amount of seat room for each passenger, and then maybe the airliners will compete on other things other than packing people closer together. And I'm not actually proposing this specific thing, but it's more like a metaphor for the idea that you can restrict competition in bad areas and then allow it to blossom in other areas. I totally agree with you that we don't want to generally restrict competition. We want to restrict certain types of competition that lead to bad outcomes. In the back.
Adding on to what you were saying about greed leading to self-destruction, if we're under the assumption that the market is formed by individuals, how can we tie this in with Adam Smith's invisible hand? Are we actually subject to that, or is greed going to just unbalance the market?
Well, I'm glad you asked about Adam Smith, because, of course, Adam Smith published two famous books, The Wealth of Nations and also The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And The Theory of Moral Sentiments is a very psychological book. It's amazingly ahead of its time. Economists are only now starting to create models that kind of catch up to Smith's insight. But when you put the two sides of Adam Smith together, and there are many, many papers that have done this, Smith was never arguing that purely self-interested individuals pursuing their own goal would promote the public good. Smith had a very deep psychological theory of human behavior. He believed that people were inherently ethical, inherently altruistic, and so on. And so his faith in the power of markets to promote well-being was really was based on a foundation of people being actually good people, ethical people. And so if you put the two sides of Smith together, then you get to the conclusion that the raw invisible hand, the way that the invisible hand has often been interpreted to mean that just untrammeled competition will bring out the best, that's not what Smith intended at all. Other questions?
A little bit following with that idea, I was thinking about also the big departments in companies that have been increasing over the last decade of corporate responsibility and ethics, and how could this be related to that? Is it a response to a way to rationalize the greed, or maybe an opposing tendency that is also like emerging?
I mean, I think in some cases, the motivation for establishing these units is cynical, that they want to put up a good front. But in other situations, probably companies are really genuinely concerned about the degradation of ethics by their employees. And they are establishing these units truly for the purpose that they claim. Whether they are beneficial, whether these things are beneficial, I have no idea. I can say that I'm very skeptical of the way that ethics tends to be taught in business schools. That when in business schools, if you take a course on ethics, do you have such a course here on corporate ethics? Generally, what you learn a bunch of rules, and this is like the Kantian golden rule and so on. And really, to teach ethics, in my own opinion, most of us, we think that we're ethical, and it's only we fall into a situation of greed where we become desperate, and then we behave unethically and we surprise ourselves. We don't expect it to happen, and then looking back on it, we can't even understand how we behaved that way. I think that courses on ethics need to be much more hands-on. They need to put people through a situation where they actually behave in an unethical fashion so they can kind of feel what it's like. And my concern about these ethics units in corporations is that they're very much like the courses on ethics that I've seen at various schools. They're kind of abstract, but they don't really deal with the root cause of unethical behavior. Yes.
Yes, you compared greed to to desperation, like fear in some way. So I think that history has proved that a certain degree of fear can be useful to keep you alive.
Yeah.
So the question is, do you think that a certain degree of greed could be positive in some way?
It's funny that you ask that because I wrote a op-ed piece from my local newspaper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, arguing, sometimes looking at the financial crisis, a number of people have attributed the financial crisis to an excess of fear, that fear has driven down housing prices, fear has driven down stock. And I said, the problem isn't too much fear, the problem isn't that we're too afraid now, the problem is that we weren't sufficiently afraid before. We weren't afraid of Madoff, even though he was giving supranormal returns year after year after year. And we weren't afraid of housing prices. We were ready to believe that housing prices were going to rise forever, and so on. So, yeah, I totally agree with the idea that a little bit of fear is good, and that if there's a problem with fear, it's that we don't experience enough of it. And I think self-interest is good, too. And I mean, it's a very good question. Is fear analogous? It raises the question: is fear analogous to greed? And I would say that greed is more analogous to appetites like an addiction or hunger or thirst than it is to fear. But you're absolutely right that some degree these drives and these emotions exist for good reasons. And often a small amount of something is good, but when it gets too extreme, if you're too hungry, if you're too deprived, if you're too fearful, that tends to lead to bad outcomes. But it's a very profound question. Yes?
Thank you very much for this talk. You're looking at cheating, and did you look at the other side, the people who are cheated? And in particular, my question is, do you think that if you're cheated, you should make it public, or to try to end this spiral of this habit forming of cheating other people? How do you see this communication about cheating like this? Because it's a difficult issue.
I mean, if you get cheated, you're asking, yeah. I mean, it's kind of this is a classic, I think normal economics, standard economics sheds a lot of light on this. It's a bit of a free rider problem. From a personal interest perspective, when you get cheated, the best thing to do is walk away, because unless you can possibly recover some of the money or something like that. But usually, the best thing from a personal interest perspective when you get cheated is to just walk away and try never to interact with the person who cheated you again. From a public perspective, you're doing society great good by exposing the cheater so that other people won't be vulnerable to the person. And it's a classic free rider problem. And the answer depends on whether you want to do what's best for yourself or what's best for society. Sometimes, here again, this goes back to the question about fear being good. Sometimes anger might be bad for the individual but good for society. So if you get really angry, you might expose the person. And that's not necessarily in your interest, but it might be in society's interest. In fact, economist Bob Frank has a book that's all about that, Passions Within Reason. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Related to fear, previously you said about Madoff giving supranormal.
Oh, there you are. Okay. Okay.
So, supranormal interest rates,
yes.
About 12% per year. Perhaps not fear, but mistrust. Have we learned the sort of lection or the values that should not be questioned in the future? So are we going to repeat, in fact, the same crisis of values in the previous years after, let's say, 5 years of good economy or wealth growth? Are we going to have this same crisis in values again?
I mean, I wish I could say that we're not. But if you look at human history and human nature, it seems to be a virtual inevitability that we will. I mean, look at recent history, very recent history. In the late 1990s, we had the dot-com boom, and people were bidding up the price of ridiculous companies that didn't have any product, never had a product. Petwalking.com. The most absurd companies were going public and fetching huge stock prices. And all the pundits were telling us the old rules don't apply, the old rules of stock valuation don't apply. It's a new era. Okay, then we have the dot-com crash. Barely not even a decade later, what happens? We have real estate boom, and real estate prices are going through the ceiling, and the pundits are out telling us that the old rules of real estate valuation don't apply. And people, only 10 years later, people are just jump in, both feet, and are ready to make the same mistake again. So if we didn't learn from .com and apply it to the real estate boom, I have no idea what the next bubble is going to be, but I can say with almost virtual certainty that there is going to be one. We just can't figure out what it is.
Now we're just on the point of Prosper Kahneman-Tversky theory. We just want to get back to zero. So we very readily want to get back to zero. But
That's
once
right.
we're there, we'll just think, no, this is a new era again, and perhaps if regulation is not implemented in the proper way,
That's
we'll
right.
just repeat.
Yeah, and it's going to be, as you say, it's the desire to get back to zero. It's going to be, greed is going to pull us out of, is probably going to pull us out of the recession, and this goes back to this question about fear. Greed could be a good thing right now. We need some greed to get the economy going, but inevitably it's going to overshoot, and we're going to be back in the same situation.
Just going back to those experiments you showed earlier, in theory, I understand that the subjects chosen for those experiments were chosen at random without any factors, any personal income, wealth, social class, anything like that. I wondered if you conducted any experiments that links like higher greed and need for cheating to people with higher incomes. This view that the richer the people, the more need they have to cheat and greed to obtain, like, you know, a higher price, whether there is any link to that or not.
Well, our theory would be not that rich people are more likely to cheat, but that people who feel poor, even if they're rich, people who feel poor are more likely to cheat. This is not exactly about greed, but we did some studies of lottery, people playing the lottery. And in these studies, we had people fill out a survey, and the survey was about their, these are people who were taking the bus and coming through Pittsburgh and changing buses. And we asked them about their attitudes towards Pittsburgh, and then we asked them for their income. For half the people, we said, what's your income? 0 to 10,000, 10,000 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50, or 50 and above. So even people who take the bus in the United States tend to be poor, but on that scale, most people did pretty well. The other half of the people, we said, what's your income? 0 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 and, up to $250,000 or $250,000 and above. So almost all of the bus passengers were in the lowest income group. And we randomly assigned people to get one of these questions or the other. And they had no idea that the income question was significant. And then we said, in exchange, because you've completed the survey, we're going to give you $5. And by the way, you can buy as many lottery tickets, $1 lottery tickets as you want with the $5. You can buy none, 1, 2, 3, or 5, 4 or 5. And what we found was that when we made people feel poor, that is, when we asked them, what's your income, 0 to 50, 50 to 100, and so on, they played the lottery, they purchased twice as many tickets as when we made them feel rich. And so I think, applied to this situation, my guess is that it's not that rich people are more likely to cheat, but my guess is that it's when people feel poor that they are more likely to cheat. They might be rich, but if they feel poor, like in the experiment that I showed you, when people only gained 5 cents for every question that they got right. So there was not much incentive to cheat, but they thought, I should be getting 25 cents. I could have been getting 25 cents. That's when they cheated. It wasn't when they got 25 and they could have gotten 5. So I think the answer is that, again, it is the feeling, it's when people feel subjectively poor that they are more likely to cheat.
Time is cheating on us now. And we have to stop, I'm afraid. We feel very deprived. But thank you very much, George, very much for your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lowenstein, for this enlightening talk. The success of it, it's clear by the many questions that we had. And I think we all leave this room with new thoughts about how to think about our rational agents in our models and how we teach them to our students. I would like to mention, because I'm sure the rector, if he was here, he would like to say that it's actually the Facultat de Ciències Econòmiques i Empresarials and also the Department of Economics and Business that is really a success story, and it's always a reference in the overall of the university. We have students that are very highly prepared coming to the university. We are very successful in placement. We have good graduate programs, and we now have some former students that are already taking very important positions in the business world and also in the administration. So it's fair to say that from the university feels that this is a very special group that is giving a lot of leading ideas for other groups in the university. And also the university is planning to help somehow to keep growing and keeping this quality with some actions that will take place in the very near future. Before we go, I would like to thank our sponsors, Garrigues Abogados and Laboratoris Esteve, who are represented here by Mr. Rodés and Mr. Raffles. It's always a pleasure to have them here, but also it's more than that, because we really need them to keep having these very high standard conferences every year. So thank you all for attending, and I think I officially have to declare the opening of the course, although we've been working already, students and professors, for quite a few days. Thank you.